Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? I am very excited to introduce today's guest to you. He is Fareed Zakaria, host of CNN's Fareed Zakaria GPS, one of cable's highest quality news programs, and one that often features long-form interviews and conversations with intellectuals, policymakers, CEOs, and some of the world's most powerful political leaders, including former American President Barack Obama, Russian President Vladimir Putin, China's former premier, Wen Jiabao, Turkey's Tayyip Erdogan, and the list goes on and on. But I'm especially excited to have Dr. Zakaria on the program today because his 1997 article in Foreign Affairs on the rise of illiberal democracy and his subsequent book on the future of freedom were part of the core syllabus in my introductory college class to American foreign policy, alongside the works of people like Samuel Huntington, Francis Fukuyama, Walter Russell Mead, and others. So whenever I get a chance to speak with or meet someone whose work has had such an impact in shaping my early thinking and understanding of any subject, not just international relations, I can't help but feel a certain sense of nostalgia and excitement that will probably come across certainly in the overtime, where we really get into some of my favorite topics, including a conversation comparing the ideological planks of the Democratic and Republican parties and their futures, prospects for international cooperation and competition, the unique challenges posed by the emerging multipolar order, and how Fareed thinks about the threat posed by large power conflict today versus 50 or 100 years ago. In the first part of our conversation, we discuss Fareed's new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, which unsurprisingly includes a conversation about the pandemic and our response to it, but also its implications for the world post-2020. We also discuss the issue of censorship in media and big tech, as well as what I've often described as a crisis of epistemology in Western society. In other words, our struggle with how to arrive at the truth or a consensus view of reality based on a system of reasoning and empirical analysis whose conclusions rise above political or corporate narratives and the exigencies of the moment. It's a conversation that raises many fascinating and interesting questions that we explore in depth, so I'm very excited to share it with all of you today. Now, for anyone who is new to the Hidden Forces podcast, we do not accept commercial sponsors. These are unhurried, long-form conversations that typically last anywhere between 90 minutes to 2 hours, the second half of which is made available to our premium subscribers, along with transcripts to each conversation, as well as notes in the forms of rundowns that I put together ahead of each and every episode. We only got through a fraction of the questions and topics that I was prepared to discuss with Fareed in this conversation. So if you're interested to know where my head is at with these topics or what other questions I was intending to ask, you can find all of that in my 20-page rundown for this week's episode. This is an unusual model that we've chosen with this podcast, but it gives me a level of personal freedom to focus entirely on the content and conversations, which I find invaluable. If you feel the same way, and if Hidden Forces brings value to your life, consider becoming a premium subscriber through our Patreon page. If that's not an option for you, there are still other things you can do to support the show by tweeting out our episodes, sending them to your friends, and writing us a review on Apple Podcasts. Every bit of support helps, especially in a climate like this, where independent voices are needed and where we face significant resistance in breaking through the noise of partisan rancor and disinformation in our media. And on that note, please enjoy this week's conversation with my guest, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Such a pleasure to be on.
Well, we got to know each other over the last hour, so usually I start these conversations with a kind of a prelude, and I do want to actually ask some background questions about you because, as I mentioned to you, I first read A Liberal Democracy as a book, not as your foreign affairs paper, which I believe originally came out in 1997.
The paper came out, the article came out in 1997, and then the book came out in 2002 or 2003.
Right.
I remember because it was before the Iraq War, and I argued that Iraq would not become a liberal democracy, which turned out to be sadly true.
Yeah, the book is actually rather prescient and perhaps in some ways more relevant today than it was even then. And I said that we read a number of sort of foundational documents in that class. Yours was identified as one of those. So was Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. So was George Kennan's The Sources of Soviet Conduct and others. And it was really one of my favorite classes, if not my favorite classes in college, and one I've mentioned before. I'm curious to know a little bit about you. I actually have a picture in my rundown here of you. It must have been you because I found it on Google. Looks like you're eating from a rice bowl or something when you were a kid. I tried to find young pictures of you. This is the only one I found. I'm curious how someone becomes a Fareed Zakaria, because at this point, you're sort of bigger than just your individual identity. You've been around for so long. You're, I think, generally seen as one of the foremost foreign policy experts in media today. And GPS, your program, has been running for now how long?
GPS has been running for 12 years. In fact, a little bit more than 12. But I can give you the quick story if you want. I mean, we could start with me growing up in India. I grew up in India. My dad was a politician. My mother was a journalist. And so I grew up in a house, consumed by these issues. We would talk about them at the dinner table all the time. And to the great credit of my parents, they really included us as kids in all these conversations. So my father's political fortunes and future, my mother's decisions about what to put on the cover of the magazine she was involved with, all that became our dinner table conversation. So I kind of grew up with this stuff. Then applied for a scholarship to American universities, got into Yale, went to Yale, had a totally transforming experience. Just, I was a bit of a nerd in high school, got to college, found other people like me who were interested in ideas, interested in the world, was fairly politically active. And then I go to grad school. I get a scholarship at Harvard. I'm a total product of scholarships all the way through. Thought I was going to be an academic. In fact, started out, by the end of my graduate student years, I was already teaching and things like that. And then stumbled into journalism because I got what seemed like an irresistible opportunity to be the managing editor of Foreign Affairs. Which was a kind of bridge between academia and journalism and public policy. So I took that. And then after a few years, somebody asked me to write a column for Newsweek. I took that. Then after that, ABC News asked me if I would start doing some TV. So you see what I'm describing is the kind of inching away from academia into more and more mainstream journalism and broader journalism. And here I am now on basic cable. But I've still maintained my academic interests. I still read, I do research, I try to write books. It's hard, but I do have a new book out.
Well, we're going to talk about that because I've read the book and I'm excited to discuss it. I'm curious, did you ever consider going into policy, or was there something about journalism and writing about foreign affairs that attracted you more?
It's funny you say that because I had always grappled with that question of whether or not I should try to get more involved in policy. And I always thought I would. I thought I'd in some way end up more actively engaged in making foreign policy, not just commenting on it and on the world. And I think a few things happened. The first is I was not an American citizen. I was a foreign student. And so I didn't have an American passport. I tried as quickly as I could to naturalize. I fell in love with this country and wanted to become an American. But, the immigration service took its own time, totally understandably. And so for a while, I just didn't have that option didn't exist. Meanwhile, I was doing better and better in journalism, and I was able to have a larger and larger audience. I was able to get more ambitious in what I was doing. So those things, I think, meant that I kept, in a sense, pricing myself out of the market, as it were. I was doing very well in journalism and had not had much exposure to the policy world, had not paid my dues, as it were, because, I couldn't for a while. But then there was, I think, a bigger thing, which is I realized, because, honestly, people have been kind enough to offer me jobs in government. And I think I came to realize that I really valued my independence. And I really valued my ability to just say what I thought and not have to toe the party line or curry favor or, and it's not, I don't mean it as any kind of great virtue. I just mean temperamentally, I realized I was the kind of person who placed a lot of value on that and wasn't willing to make some of those sacrifices that are totally understandable, to be part of a team and to support a candidate. But it wasn't really for me. And maybe if I had been an American citizen when I was 22 years old, right out of college, I would have worked on, a campaign or like been a gopher in the State Department or the White House, and it would have been all different. But at this point, I've developed enough of a sense of my mind and my voice that I don't really want to compromise it.
Yeah, it's difficult to maintain objectivity and to indulge your intellectual curiosity from afar when you're actually aligned with one particular party or you're working in the policy space. And you've had a chance to interview people like Barack Obama, Vladimir Putin, Erdogan. I mean, it's just a who's who list of people. And I imagine that if you're an intellectually curious person, it must be a really satisfying a career and way to live your life. So let's switch to your book, because as I said, I mentioned that I read the book. I really enjoyed it. Let's begin with that. And I do, of course, want to ask you about geopolitics, foreign relations, policy politics, and et cetera. But they all actually do tie into the book. When did you get the idea to write this book? Was it brewing before the pandemic in a different way? And when the pandemic happened, you thought about writing it? I should mention the name of the book is 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. How did you get the idea and why did you want to write it?
It's a great question and a strange story. So I was working on another book. I'm sort of always working on a book, but I had begun to work in earnest on another book, which is a much larger book, really about the history of political realignments and revolutions. I kind of feel like we're going through one of those right now. And so I was trying to make sense of it. And I've been reading a lot about the French Revolution and taking notes and things like that. And then the pandemic hits. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, in a strange way, I have a little more time now because I can, all my travel is canceled and things like that. And I started to work a little bit more earnestly and kind of spend more time on this other book. And I just couldn't get all the thoughts about the pandemic out of my head. And I kept thinking to myself, yeah, that's, it's fascinating to see what the English Revolution was like and the Dutch Revolution and the French Revolution. But right now, out of the window, we're going through this huge change. And I kept returning to it. So after a week or so, I realized that I was really just trying to work out in my own mind what was going on. And so I started writing down just on pieces of paper what I thought was happening. What are the long-term trends that this pandemic was causing? Obviously, because I had to write a weekly column and to do the show, these were thoughts that were not getting lost in the ether. I was using some of them for the show and the column. But about 2 weeks in, I then say to myself, you know what? This is the book I should write because I'm so motivated by it. I'm so, this is my way of working out in my own head what's going on. So I called up my publisher and I said, that book I owe you, what if I gave you another book before that? And he was skeptical initially, but when I described it and then I sent him an outline, he called me back and he said, "This is fabulous. You really have, you've been thinking about this a lot. Let's do it, but you got to write it fast." So I said, all right. And so for the next 4 months, what I did, and this is now, kind of April, May, June, July, and a bit of August, I just would get up every morning at 6:30. I would not read anything, no newspapers, nothing, because I wanted to be able to kind of levitate intellectually, 15,000 feet above what was going on at a day-to-day level, and ask myself, project forward, like what's really happening here? And of course, it brought up all kinds of thoughts I had in general about society and about technology and about war and peace. But it allowed me to do it in a way that I was asking myself, what is the pandemic's interaction with these forces? What is, where are we going? And then by about 11 o'clock, I'd get back to the ground, deal with, my column, the show, my 3 kids with me most of the time. And so I'd kind of get back to life. But having that period in the morning when I could just suspend myself and look forward turned out to be incredibly valuable.
I mean, that's fascinating that you were able to do that. Maybe you sort of have to do that given your line of work. It must be very easy to get distracted. What do you feel are the consequences of this pandemic, and why did you feel so motivated to write about them?
One way to think about it is, I was talking to an Indian businessman who was saying to me, when I look at 9/11, it didn't really have much impact on my life. He said, I was, living in India. It's something between the United States, a few Middle Eastern countries. It changed travel procedures in a place like India a little bit, but that was it. I look at the global financial crisis. We didn't have any of those leveraged products. We didn't have any of those derivatives. And he said nobody knew in India had them. We felt it a little bit because of the recession, the global recession. But other than that, it had no effect on us. The pandemic, he said, has affected the life of every single person in India in some way or the other, right? Between the public health aspect, the lockdowns, the economic fallout. And I was thinking to myself, this pandemic is probably the first event in our lifetimes that has really affected everybody on the planet. It's very rare to have one of those kinds of events. And so when you think about the impact it's having, there is the first order public health impact. There's the second order economic impact, which is huge. There is the acceleration of digital life. But then there is what it has done to us psychologically as human beings. As we have become much more isolated, we have had to fall back on small numbers of family and friends. And that's happened to a greater or lesser degree for really everybody on the planet. And how often does something like that happen? So it's really a kind of truly a historical event we're living through.
So I have many questions about the pandemic specifically. One that I don't think is often enough discussed is our sort of psychosomatic response to it. Have you thought about that at all? What our emotional response to the pandemic is and what it says about our resilience as a society?
I have, and it's actually a very difficult subject. It's one where you really have to sit back and think a lot. There's not, you can't read a lot about it. The way I think about it is when we face something like this pandemic, what's interesting to me is that we all immediately go to the external supports, solutions, policies that we want to help us. And they're all real and they're important, whether it's the public health response, the economic response, all that stuff. All those things are the kind of external supports that will allow us to navigate this. But there's also a huge amount going on internally in each of us. And we don't think a lot about the internal supports we need to navigate this. We are sheltering in place. We are isolated. To the extent we are engaging with people, it's a small coterie of family and friends. We're not traveling that much. So all those things are happening to us. And we have to ask ourselves, like, what are the inner supports we can find for it? And so one of the things I've been grappling with is asking myself, what do I need in these circumstances? Incredibly powerful help to me for those first few months in particular when everything really shut down was the fact that my kids were with me most of the time. So I have 3 children. One is at college, one is in boarding school, and one goes to one is 12. But because of the pandemic, they all ended up at home. And my ex-wife and I kind of shared custody, so it was a week on, week off. But that feeling of just being bonded with your children was incredibly powerful, and in some ways probably got me through it better than anything else. Very close friends proved to be another incredibly important part to me kind of getting through this. For me, because of the kind of nerd I am, a lot of reading helped. Just the ability to kind of try to make sense of this by reading about other pandemics, reading about, in a sense, the book is my catharsis of being able to deal with this. But, and then there was exercise and, I always try but fail at meditation. But, I think that we don't think enough about all that. We're very quick to say, we need a stimulus, we need a vaccine, we need to wear masks, all of which is true. But there's this other piece which is equally important, which we should spend some time thinking about.
So let's talk about those other things, the vaccine, the masks, the government response, the lockdowns, the economy. How do you feel that we, both as a country, the United States, and collectively on the international stage, responded to and dealt with this pandemic? And what does that reveal about the challenges that we face in terms of governing ourselves and in terms of our economy going forward, in your view?
It's a great question. I think that what this pandemic has revealed is that the most important issue that we face collectively is not the quantity of government, but the quality of government. It's one of my lessons, but I think it's really important because, the 20th century was dominated by this ideological debate. How much government is good? If you wanted little, you were capitalist. If you wanted really a lot, you were a socialist. And that became the big divide. But what the pandemic has revealed is that the most important issue is not the quantity, it's the quality. Do you have high-functioning bureaucracies? Do you have high-functioning technocrats? Do you have a government that can act early and intelligently? Because the countries that really handle this best, which are all in East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, even Vietnam, a much poorer country, all of them, by the way, don't have very big governments because they don't have very large pension programs and things like that. But they are all very efficient. They have high-quality government. They recruit some of the smartest people in the country to be in those government positions. They're respected. They're given autonomy. They're well-funded. And that proved to be incredibly important because you had to act early, you had to act aggressively, you had to act intelligently, and you needed the social trust of the population so that when you said wear a mask, for example, everybody wore a mask. Whereas in the West, by and large, you had a much more mixed response. And the countries which have been the most skeptical about government, Britain and the United States, have done the worst. The countries that have bad government, not because they're ideologically opposed to it, but because they've just always had bad government, like Italy, also did very badly. The one country in the Western world that is large, that has handled COVID-19 pretty well, is Germany. And Germany has had a long tradition of a strong state, respect for the state, very high quality people still go into it. So that turned out to be the big divide. And I think I would add one final point, which is that the worst of all worlds was if you had ineffective government and were arrogant and didn't believe in learning from others. This sort of idea that you're special, you're exceptional. Those countries, Great Britain, the United States, Brazil in Latin America, did particularly badly.
Well, I do want to ask you maybe later what lessons we can learn from other countries. But I'm curious about this point about skepticism, because, of course, in America's DNA, there's always been, I think, more skepticism of the federal government and concentrated power, at least from a governmental standpoint, maybe not from a corporate standpoint, than in Europe. But it does seem that we're going through a heightened phase of that in recent years. And that also speaks to what I think is what I've talked about and thought about as a sort of crisis of epistemology in Western society, where the tools for reasoned inquiry and investigation are no longer perceived as being sufficient for providing communal access to a consensus view of truth. And that, combined with a loss of trust in authority figures, as well as something that you talk about in your book, which is a striking misunderstanding on the part of many of what science actually is and is not, has really created a profound psychosomatic convulsion in the public mind. And I'm curious how that ties into this larger conversation about skepticism and how you see that as someone who not only works in television, but at CNN.
Gosh, there's a lot there to unpack. So let's just put aside for a moment the sort of anti-statist tradition of the United States. As you say, we've always been skeptical of power, of authority. I mean, Americans' natural approach toward power is to distrust it. And that in some ways makes us unique. The British have some of it, and then Reagan heightens that with the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, which was essentially a kind of assault on the federal government, on central government. Because what you're talking about is also something much deeper, which is a kind of psychological attitude that is deeply skeptical of power, deeply skeptical of authority, and deeply skeptical of the idea of collective enterprises. So that's always been true in American history, but it has from time to time created the conditions for a real paranoia and conspiracy theories that have abounded. You know, you think of the 50s and McCarthyism, you think of the JFK assassination, you think of even the people who thought that the United States government faked the moon landings, you think of after 9/11, you know, the unfortunately somewhat widespread view that there was something, we were not told the full story. Why does that happen? And why does it happen in America in particular? Because we have this deep skepticism. Unfortunately, what that has gotten married to are two forces. One, social media environment, a new media environment in which you can amplify and highly charge very minority views that are held very intensely. So the thing about social media is it privileges not the truth. It privileges not even the majority view. It privileges the most intensely felt minority views. And those get the biggest salience. I mean, Twitter is the best example of this, right? If you were to look at Twitter, you would have a very distorted view of what the actual American public is like, because, you know, it's the most extremes on all sides. But that now has a very powerful effect in shaping the agenda. And then final piece to this, I would say, and I try not to be, highly partisan, but one political party has weaponized this in a way that is, I think, very destructive of the truth and very destructive of normal civilized politics. The Republican Party has decided, really ever since Newt Gingrich and the revolution of the 1990s, that it is going to approach this with a kind of take no prisoners attitude, shred whatever norms exist, shred whatever sense of civil discourse exists, because it is a very effective way to mobilize the most intense support that you can, to weaponize it against the other party, to create the kind of negative polarization that excites people. It's been very effective from a political point of view, but I think the price we have paid is in the quality of our discourse, the quality of our democracy, and the quality of our, kind of civic culture.
A lot of interesting points there. One, I do think that the media history of talk radio and Roger Ailes and Fox is a fascinating one, and definitely plays a huge role in changing the way that people relate to news and turning it from something that was more objective to more partisan. And I think you've seen that obviously initially with Fox. You've seen it with CNN. It's really a different company than it was in the early 90s, and MSNBC, and to a lesser degree perhaps, but in some of the mainstream press organizations. Two thoughts came up while you were talking. One was in trying to really investigate what the roots are of this loss of trust in the public. Partly, I wonder to what degree it's cyclical, because as you said, we have seen this in times past. There is a technological dimension to it today that is different, but we've seen it many times, particularly in wartime. But I wonder to what degree our misadventure in Iraq after 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis with its associated bailouts of the financial industry have contributed to a lack of trust on the part of the public in the ruling political class and in the news media. That's my first question. And my second question is partly a response to your point about partisanship, but also stems from an observation about the changing norms in our discourse, and again, in our approach to fact-finding and epistemology. And that has to do with censorship. One of the disturbing trends of recent years has been the expansive role currently being played by many of the large tech platforms who have taken it upon themselves, in reaction to political pressure, to serve an increasingly editorial function by deciding what is and is not true, distinguishing, in other words, between fact and fiction, a role that we once assigned exclusively to journalists and perhaps at the limit to our court system. Is that something that concerns you? So those are my two questions. One, what responsibility do our politicians and media institutions bear for this lack of trust on the part of the public? And two, are you concerned that these large private corporations are in a position to function as gatekeepers of information and arbiters of truth in public discourse?
On the first one, as I said, I really do think that there is no getting away from the fact that the Republican Party has decided that this is a very powerful way it can mobilize its forces. It can weaponize them. Some of this is technology. It's much easier. If you think about the 1970s, you had a highly cartelized system. The cartel was basically the three networks, maybe you could say 3 or 4 newspapers, and that was really it. And that was the media. That was who set the agenda every day. And we've gone now to hundreds and hundreds of news outlets. And the result of that is not that the central media platforms don't get a lot of people still. They do. But they are shaped by the reality that there are very intense views held on, by people in all these different places. And Fox is the perfect example of that, right? There's still 3 or 4 million people in a country of 340 million people. But it's the fact that these people hold these views so intensely, so passionately, they participate so much. And then it creates a kind of loop where you can see that, for example, with this current election, the Fox viewers don't want to give up. And the politicians then pander to them and say, yes, in fact, Trump has not lost. It's been stolen. And, and as it becomes a feedback mechanism where each side feeds the other, and, they're each doing this for entirely self-interested reasons. The Fox people want to do it because it keeps the base stoked and it keeps the viewers active and engaged. The politicians are doing it because the viewers seem to be more energized because of that. And, you're missing the fact that this is all, kind of like a weird, dark fantasy that is affecting the quality of our democratic governance. So I think there's no question that politicians have played a large role, but they are one actor in a complex chain. Politicians always respond to incentives, and the question is when the incentives get really bad, unfortunately, they become the way they do. Look at somebody like Lindsey Graham, who was probably the most articulate senior Republican, him and Mitt Romney probably, arguing against Donald Trump in 2015, arguing that he really was a bad human being, bad for the party, and a sign that our democracy was in danger. And look at Lindsey Graham today, who has become this servile sycophant of Donald Trump. And it's just because he realized that that was where the base of the Republican Party was. That was how he was going to stay a senator. That was how he was going to stay politically viable. And it's a kind of somebody should one day write a play about it's a kind of Dr. Faustus-like a story of a man who just made this bargain with the devil in order to preserve his power. Now, the second question you ask is more complicated, I think, which is about the role of these media platforms and of censorship. Look, I think we are all trying to figure out what these platforms mean. So the argument that the platforms make is, look, we're just literally like the pipe. We do nothing other than create the infrastructure, and then people just put on it what they want. We can't be held liable for it. We shouldn't be asked to censor it. We shouldn't be asked to be engaged in any way. I think increasingly people are coming to the view, correctly in my view, that isn't quite right, that the internet has become so much just the air we breathe, that there has to be some other way to describe what these platforms are doing. I myself am uneasy with the idea that it should be left up to Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg to decide what is good speech and what is bad speech, what is truth and what is lies. I think this is an area for regulation. This is an area for government to get involved. That is how democratic politics should work. Now, I haven't figured out what that would mean exactly in terms of how it would be compatible with free speech, how you'd make it work so that, people had the ability to voice all the views that they should rightly be allowed to voice. But there's something off here in the way in which we are allowing these platforms to really spread extraordinary amounts of falsehoods, untruths, lies. I mean, I look at the culture here compared with the culture in Europe politically, and we are doing a worse job. Now, we have more extreme protections on freedom of speech, to be sure, which we've always felt were a great advantage. But in this case, I wonder whether democratic societies, and all European countries are liberal democracies, whether liberal democracies that have a slightly more nuanced view of how to think about this issue, of how to deal with the reality of both free speech, but also the pervasive ability for people to tell lies, falsehoods, how to make those balances work. I feel like the Europeans might be doing a better job. And I think it's only going to get worse as we enter the world of real deep fakes and things like that, where you really will not be able to tell the difference between fact and fiction.
I agree. I agree that the Europeans are doing a better job with this. I think they've also just taken it more seriously. I also would agree, because I think this is what you're getting at, that the issue of censorship is actually a part of a much bigger issue, which is that these large tech platforms like a Facebook or a Google, they operate with a scientific level of sophistication when it comes to behavioral modification. And that's an extraordinary amount of power to exist in the hands of a corporation, or in any hands, to be quite honest. So it seems to me that the regulatory overhaul here is a much broader and bigger issue. And to the extent that we've discussed it on our podcast with people like Shoshana Zuboff or Sinan Aral or others, we've actually done a number of episodes on this, it seems to me that the ad model itself, i.e. selling users' data and using that to create a marketplace to target them and effectively to manipulate their behavior, to tie monetization with your ability to actually steer them in the direction of your commercial outcomes, is actually not compatible with this type of technology if you want to have a free society with individual agency. Where do you fall on that?
I hear you. I understand the argument. I think that Surveillance Capitalism book is very, very interesting. I'm not sure what the remedy is. I think that, if you ask people, for example, if you said to people, you own your data, but if you want to use Gmail and Google Docs and all the variety of things that Google provides you with, you have to allow Google to sell your data. I suspect most people would say yes, because I don't think they place a very high value on it. I think that, it may vary a little bit, and I think that it creates... You have one example of this where the Europeans put into place that right to privacy, right, which is why we all now have to click one more time on the accept cookies button when you go through a website. They did that because they were trying to limit the monopoly power, particularly of Google in search. What's fascinating is it has actually had the opposite effect. It has consolidated and expanded the largest companies at the expense of smaller ones. Why? Because if you're surfing and if you are asked that question, you are more likely to say no to some small fly-by-night mom-and-pop internet operation website that you've never heard of. But if it's a big organization or a website, you assume that they have reputational costs, they have brand image, and so they are going to protect your data in a more reasonable way. And so Google's market share actually expanded after the introduction of those protections. So it's a good example of, how you'd have to come up with some very well-crafted legislation. One place to look, by the way, is India. I have seen a number of Indian entrepreneurs tech entrepreneurs, including the guy who's leading the mobile revolution in India, Mukesh Ambani, say that they would like to move to a model where default position is the opposite of what it is in the West. The default position is that you own all your data, including your browsing history. And companies may negotiate with you to buy your data or rent your data or seek your data, but those transactions have to be made, and there has to be an accounting. You have to be essentially told at the end of every year you have to be paid something. So that's a very interesting model. I suspect most people would still go along with it. I mean, they get a lot of value from something like Google or Facebook or Amazon, but it would change the dynamic, I think.
Very interesting. I have a lot of thoughts here. You mentioned very early on in your answer that perhaps people should have the choice about, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but the choice about whether to be served ads or not. I wonder if there are certain choices that individuals simply should not be able to make, because when they're made, I mean, if you think about it from a game theory standpoint, at the individual level, everyone is better off individually by taking a certain decision, but at scale, it becomes problematic. A good example is a gas tax, for example. Someone might be incentivized to buy a larger engine vehicle, but if there are issues around emissions and pollution at scale, we might all be better off if we collaborate or cooperate. And there are lots of examples of this, particularly when it comes to economic externalities. What you're describing to me, given how powerful this technology is, runs the risk of turning our economy into something that has never really existed before. Because while we've had feudalistic economies where people traded their labor in exchange for the right to work someone else's land, in this type of a system, people would themselves become the crop. They would become the yield, the bounty for these private corporations to sell into a marketplace that would exist completely outside of human agency. And I'm not sure that such an economy is compatible with a system of liberal democracy. So I'm curious, what you think of that, or if you think it's too pessimistic.
Well, it's a very interesting idea. And I think I absolutely agree with you that we are entering a completely new world with this digital economy, where essentially the entire economy is becoming digital. One of the chapters of my book is Life is Digital, because I really think we are entering a world where there is essentially no difference between the physical economy and the digital economy. And so the point you are making is that in a digital economy, do we have different fundamental rules about what it means to operate a free market, what it means to retain individual autonomy and freedom? I think that, the question you'd have to ask yourself is, how do you limit the ability of people to monetize a product that people want? Because the great virtue of the internet is scale. The reason I use websites and search and all these things is because everybody else is on it, right? So you probably don't want to do something that sacrifices that. And in order to get that scale, you have to allow the product to be free. So if the product is free, how do they monetize it if you don't allow them to sell ads? It's an interesting, I haven't thought a lot about it, but it feels to me like that's the dilemma. You do want the near universality that the internet allows, because that is the extraordinary appeal of it. And yet, in order to get that universality, you need the goods to be free or very easy to use. And in order to get that, think of Google Maps, right? You want everybody to be using it because that's what makes it work well. And that's why it's free. But then in order for them to make money, for it to be viable, they have to be able to sell data. Is there a way around that? I agree with you that we should be thinking more creatively about this. I actually feel this way. I'm going to make a completely different reference. And this is, in my chapter about markets are not enough. I think we need to think seriously more about markets and about how to think about informed consumer choice, which is what you're talking about. Junk food companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing research to figure out how to get you to eat the 12th Dorito in the pack, or to actually, eat the whole pack. Right? They are creating physical addiction in the way they combine salt and sugar and things like that in those products. Is that a good thing? I mean, are people really free to choose when the company is essentially investing vast amounts of money to figure out how to scientifically, chemically engineer you to sort of go down this garden path like a mouse following, little pieces of bread or cheese? Or, should we think about choice in a sense of like informed choice? And if that, what would be the remedy? Would it be notices? Would it be outright bans? Would it be regulation? I feel like we shouldn't be scared to go down the path you're describing, even though I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I mean, informed choice, that's the key there. When you were responding about the advantages of having scale in these systems, what came to mind was an interesting comparison, which is this tension that we have today, which speaks to something else that you talk about in the book, which is the new emerging bipolar order, or multipolar order in some ways, from a period that was pretty much since the Cold War dominated by American hegemony. And it's this tension between the international and the intranational forces and desires. So in the case of these technology companies, on the one hand, in a perfect world, if this were a closed system, we'd only be concerned with our own government and limiting its powers. But in this case, we're living through a renewal of international great power competition, particularly with the Chinese Communist Party, where we increasingly will need to depend on our own governments to protect us from the machinations of foreign powers who have their own designs on our economic and political liberties. So how do we navigate this tension between the concerns of the founders on the one hand, having to do with too much power concentrated in the hands of the federal government, and populist concerns about corporate concentration, with, on the other, the reality that there are foreign actors capable of threatening to subvert the very freedoms that we seek to protect in the first place? Does this mean, for example, that we need to revive elements of the Cold War coalition between the government, academia, and the private sector?
It's a huge new subject that is going to loom very large as we enter this world of competition with China. As you know, I say in the book, bipolarity is inevitable. We are in a bipolar world. China is now the second largest economy in the world, second largest defense spender. But what most people don't realize, it's larger than the next 4 economies put together. It's larger than the next 4 defense budgets put together. So the US and China are now in a league of their own. And they are equally matched in many ways, even in technological terms. And you can just see that with Huawei and 5G, right? Whatever we may say about Huawei and 5G, it is clearly a better product. It is clearly cheaper. It is clearly better to use. And by the way, the Americans, we don't even have an alternative to it. Our alternative is some weird combination of Ericsson, Nokia, Qualcomm, maybe Samsung, so it's not really a full-fledged alternative. Now, the question becomes, how do you maintain the incredible dynamism that has come from having an open world economy, an open technological platforms, extraordinary amounts of trade, travel, contact, commerce, while at the same time allowing yourself to ensure that, China is playing by the rules. You are not losing out both geoeconomically to China, but also, let's be honest, geopolitically. There is a sense that China is the other great rising power, and there are legitimate reasons why the United States would not want an international system dominated by China writing the rules in China's favor, particularly because China is a, fairly illiberal authoritarian regime. So how do you make this work? This is going to be the biggest challenge we face geopolitically, because it's easy to imagine how you do a kind of rerun of the Cold War. But that isn't going to work because the world is too deeply interconnected. The height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did $2 billion of trade that year. Then the maximum point of economic interdependence, $2 billion of trade a year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. There's just a deep, deep connection, not just for the United States, for Asia, for example. When we think about how we would deal with China, Every Asian country on the continent, other than Bhutan, has China as its largest trading partner, including countries that are very wary of Chinese power and influence, like Japan or South Korea or Vietnam or India. So all of them are going to try to find some way to maintain their economic association with China to get growth and dynamism. And they are simultaneously going to want to maintain some kind of political relationship with the United States to get kind of geopolitical insurance, as it were. Now, that's going to be hard because the US and China are both going to say, you don't get to order from this menu a la carte. You can't take the economic benefits from China and the geopolitical protection from the US. And both sides are going to say that. China is going to say, if you want Huawei and the Belt and Road Initiative money, you're going to have to allow us to be geopolitically influential. And the US is going to say, if you want our geopolitical protection, you've got to sever links with Huawei and, that kind of thing. So, in fact, what's going to happen is everyone is going to be playing in this gray zone where each of them are going to make individual adjustments and balances where they have some combination that allows them to get away with it. They're all going to try to placate the Americans at one level and try to placate the Chinese at another. It's going to look much more like, the kind of really complicated European diplomacy of the 18th and 19th century than the very clear, harsh division between the free world and the unfree world of the 20th century.
I don't know if you saw it, but Joe Biden published an article in Foreign Affairs either this morning or yesterday. I mean, I saw it this morning.
It was from a while ago. They just reposted it.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah. Not that. I mean, maybe 6 months ago.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Then it makes it perhaps less relevant. The information I gleaned from it now is actually not properly contextualized, so it's not as relevant. But I am curious to ask you what you think America's role will be in this more multipolar world post-pandemic. Also, one of the things that you talk about in the book is what it will mean to, quote, live with this virus, because it's not at all clear that we have any sort of cure where we're going to get one. Perhaps a cure will be that over time it will diminish. I mean, one of the things that I think I've come away with understanding is that this virus mutates pretty often, and so one positive aspect of that is that it could diminish in virulence over time. Also, one of the more fascinating things that I think we have to look forward to in the next 4 years is what's going to happen to the Republican Party. For sure, the Democrats have their own internecine conflicts to resolve, and I think one area where that will look very interesting will be in Congress with Nancy Pelosi and the squad and some of the sort of civil war within the party. But the Republicans really, the way I've often described it, it's somewhat crude, is that Donald Trump was like the alien that burst out of the body of the crew member in this 1979 Alien movie. And the carcass, the steaming pile of flesh, was the Republican Party in 2016. And there was never really a chance for a rebirth because the Republican Party was so much Trump's party, and people that wanted to have power in that dynamic, like Lindsey Graham, as you described, had to sort of go with it. And I really wonder what we're going to see from the Republican Party, because that's one area where we could just see a huge change. Now, I don't know that we'll get through all of those, but I'm going to move us into the overtime for that part of the conversation, Fareed. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of my conversation with Fareed, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to patreon.com/Hidden Forces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Fareed, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation into the subscriber overtime. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.